And moreover, if such a mind were supreme, then it seems reasonable to assume that the grand unifying story would be a great story, one that encompasses the journey of theosis for all creatures, guiding all creation and all the creatures within it towards participation in the divine life. And, this notion really finds resonance in the teachings of St. Maximus the Confessor. So he had this idea that the many logoi represented, the divine reasons, they represented the logos. And so they were teleologically moving towards the divine logos. The many logoi tend towards the divine logos. And what's interesting is that you'll notice every compelling story there, contains certain universal elements like characters, intricate plots, many layers of meaning. The best stories have plots inside of plots, and they weave together these universal themes of like love, loss, adventure, romance, sadness, tragedy, and triumph, even the development of saintliness. Intriguingly, our world resonates with these very elements. We are characters within this narrative, each with our own unique stories, navigating the expansiveness of existence, which includes love, romance, tragedy, adventure, and the potential for personal transformation. And so, if God is perfectly good, then he would surely narrate a story that reflects these aspirations, a story of triumph and redemption, the ultimate development of saintliness. And, the narrative theology of, someone like the Cappadocian Fathers within the Eastern Greek patristics really enriches this understanding by framing the existence of something like conscious beings endowed with moral awareness as integral to God's unfolding story of redemption. So here, an orderly universe filled with beauty and purpose serves as the backdrop for the divine drama of salvation. This narrative not only sheds light on human experiences of suffering and evil, but posits that these trials are temporary elements within a broader redemptive journey. The eschaton is the ultimate fulfillment of God's purpose, and it emerges as the climax of this narrative, where God's goodness and grace triumph over adversary. And through this narrative lens, we find that the core elements of theism, like the existence of consciousness, moral agents, fine-tuning of the cosmos, the contingency of reality, the inherent beauty of creation, they integrate really seamlessly into the unfolding story of redemption. These elements become unsurprising when viewed with the light of a grand narrative. It even positions suffering, and moral challenges, not as contradictions to our belief, but as essential components that deepen the richness of our experience and ultimately lead towards divine communion. And, moreover, I draw inspiration really from Marilyn McCord Adams and her concept of defeat, which suggests that God permits what can be overcome within the overall lifetime of the creatures on the whole. This insight encourages us to shift from isolated instances of suffering to the more holistic narrative they form. So she has this analogy that just as broken pieces come together to form a beautiful mosaic whole, our fragmented experiences are woven into a coherent and stunning whole that reflects the magnificence of God's creative purpose. By recognizing the interconnectedness of all creation through this narrative framework, we perceive how, every individual plays a crucial role in the grand story of existence. This approach not only offers significant explanatory power regarding the nature of reality, but it also invites us to engage with the unfolding adventure of life. It affirms that our experiences, both joyful and sorrowful and painful, they contribute meaningfully to a tapestry of divine redemption and ultimately invite us to participate in the story that transcends time and cultivates in a glorious resolution. So to kind of summarize it, we view theism through the lens of a grand narrative, which allows us to explore the profound interconnectedness of all beings and events, guiding our understanding of both the physical and spiritual realms. And it leads us to a greater appreciation of the meaning inherent in our struggles and triumphs, and offers a vision of existence that's rich with purpose and imbued with the promise of an ultimate redemption. And so that's going to be like a bullet point summary of how I would highlight it.
Okay. All right,
And
cool.
just briefly, where I think this can be valuable within the philosophy of religion is, so you'll have these certain arguments like we were saying, like the existence of consciousness or moral awareness. Then on the atheist side, you have this, well, the problem of evil and instances of apparent hiddenness and so forth. But what I like about this narrative approach is that it can easily incorporate not only the theistic versions, but the atheological ones too. Within a story of ultimate redemption and triumph, the observation of temporary instances of suffering are not very surprising. I would postulate that at the very least, it's less surprising than a principle of indifference. That reality is just fundamentally mindless and indifferent. That we would more likely observe even the instances of suffering in a story of redemption and triumph than we would on a principle of indifference alone.
All right, awesome. I definitely want to probe a little bit more in that, but just before I get
Yeah.
into it, I just want to ask a couple of quick clarifying questions. Then I'll bring it to
Mhm.
Phil if he's got questions, and then we'll come back. But so the first, in terms of the main conclusion of this narrative argument, I think you said it shows in the end that there is a relational, purposeful mind. That's kind of
Right.
uh,
Yeah. Well,
yeah.
what it is from the start that stories, narratives, they are the kinds of things that minds do. It's minds articulate stories, and so if there's a foundational mind undergirding reality, and it's perfectly good, then we would expect a great story of eventual triumph, uh, and so forth. And that gives us a sort of hypothesis, a theory, like, okay, well, let's see how well that would explain ultimate reality. Then we start looking at the observations of problem of evil, hiddenness, kalam, fine tuning, and things like that.
do, do you think that a similar approach with the
Mm-hmm.
narrative argument, for lack of a better way of phrasing
Mm-hmm.
it, you tell me whatever you want to call it, the worldview argument or grand unifying theory argument,
Yeah,
uh,
just worldview comparison, if you will.
worldview
Kind of like I don't know if you're familiar with Graham Hoppe, but it's sort of his
Yep.
approach to comparing
Yeah.
theories. You would look at it in light of theoretical virtues like simplicity, explanatory power, unifying, and so this gives it a rich explanatory power and a real unification, that it takes independent pieces of data and sort of accumulates it into a single framework that can make sense of it.
Gotcha. Okay, so the other clarifying, because you did mention about part of this argument or the data, we teleologically the purposeful aspect would be about participating in divine reason and that sort of thing. So I was wondering, like,
Hmm.
you could argue in this way for the Christian God specifically as well.
Yes. Yes. See what I'm doing here, Dale, is it's very generic. I'm trying to keep it as generic as possible. But yes, you're absolutely right. In fact, in my own view, as you know, I'm an Orthodox Christian. I'm going to use a Christological view that, and I think some might say that adding that lowers its intrinsic probability because you're adding more ontological commitments. But I would argue that the explanatory depth of that counterbalances it, because I think a Christological narrative makes sense of the data even more, because you have God who, has solidarity with our suffering. He takes on our plight into the material world and transforms suffering. He redeems it. And so in Christ, we would expect this grand uh, narrative of redemption. And so, yeah, I think a Christological view would be even more robust. Definitely. I just wanted to keep it more generic.
Gotcha.
But
Okay.
yeah,
All
you're
right.
right. Yeah.
All right, cool. So I want to dive into the methodology and the argument in a bit more. But before I do, I want to turn it over to Phil if he's got two or three kind of questions just in general based on your opening there. So yeah, Phil, do you have any questions for Travis there?
Yeah, well, I have a couple of general questions. Is
Mhm.
is this have you published this in a book, or is this in video form? How what kind of presentation have you actually published or provided for the public for them to be able to digest and consume this?
This So what I'm doing is I'm taking tidbits from different academic works like, one is like Josh Rasmussen's great story theodicy of how he tackles the problem of evil. Another is just worldview comparison. But a lot of this is some of my own ideas that I'm just exploring. Right now, it's more in the exploratory vision. So there are, I think Josh Rasmussen is probably the one who has come the closest to doing like a great story theodicy. But what I'm wanting to do is not just the problem of evil, but for Christian, or theism as a whole, like including natural theology and like just general theism as a whole, and using it in a wider scope than like Rasmussen's paper is. So yeah, I'm just kind of getting these ideas and putting it together like from different pieces. And right now it's still in the exploratory phase. But my friend Tim Howard, he also takes this kind of view, and he's actually working on publishing a paper on this, because it's an idea, we've kind of bounced back and forth with each other.
Well, the reason I asked the question is that whoever has actually, whoever has been exposed to these ideas and to your narrative and to your explanation of it, I'm curious as to what the reception has been like. And the reason I ask that question is that I can see, even though this is kind of a generic narrative, I can see a parallel between what you're doing and the concepts that you're pursuing and the narrative that you find in the Bible, because the Bible is also one big long narrative.
Sure.
It really is.
Yeah.
And that's no accident. I don't think that it was accidental that God provided his revelation to us in history, because history has to do with narrative, it has to do with story. And
Absolutely.
and the reason that there's so much wisdom in that is that people respond to stories. People are drawn into stories. And people are going to, especially the layman, they're going to respond favorably to a narrative probably more readily than they might an abstract academic work that's presenting arguments, logical arguments for theism, which can be a little bit sterile in some cases. Now, that might not be true for someone who is passionate about philosophy and passionate about logic. But most people probably find stories and narratives more appealing and more exciting than just the academic arguments. And I have to admit that my apologetics work has been basically in the philosophical and logical side of things, and I can see how that might be a disadvantage in the way that I'm presenting everything, and so I'm kind of fascinated by the approach that you're taking, because I just think that there would be a lot of appeal, and I would think that people would really grasp onto it and would really it would draw them in.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things sort of in response to that is, like for my own particular view, so I'm an Orthodox Christian, so I take aspects from Scripture, from the writings of certain church saints throughout the church history, and various theologians that I respect. And so that's part of my narrative. And like I was telling Dale, I would take a Christological narrative that, I think, the redemption story of Christianity offers a robust explanatory vision. But another thing is what this is, one of the aims of this would be to, take this story, this narrative approach, but sort of take it up a level, like get it more into the academic sphere. Like that's sort of the idea is, because there are instances, like I was mentioning, of how it's used in the philosophy of science in court cases. It's interesting that you mentioned how, people relate to narratives like more than abstract arguments. And that's a lot of times that's what wins jury trials, is who has the better narrative. I found that out in my research when I was looking into this. And so, Yeah. I think that's true in many aspects. But what I guess the goal would be is to sort of raise the level a bit and get it more within the academic sphere, of looking at it in light of the theoretical virtues of theory choice and explaining different competing worldviews. But yeah.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, well, I'm fascinated with what you're doing, and
Mhm.
like I said, it's something that I think is lacking in it's at least lacking in my apologetic, and I think I could learn a lot from this. So I'm glad to be hearing it.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate that. It's still, don't get me wrong, it's still a work in progress. And so what I'm doing is, kind of like I was mentioning when I first came on about philosophy and exploring ideas, is right now it's sort of in the exploratory phase. That's why I'm talking to different people, like I'm talking to you guys, and you may find some concept that, well, this doesn't really add up. You shouldn't go like this. This isn't holding water. Maybe you want to reformulate it or look at it differently, or so it's still in the exploratory phase, but it is something that I am very intrigued by. And so when we're looking at various arguments within the philosophy of religion or apologetics, you could look at various arguments and it would be whether or not they fit within the narrative. And so an argument against the existence of God would be an argument that doesn't fit into the narrative, that serves no purpose within a narrative. So but you'll notice, like, a story of redemption and triumph, it makes observations of suffering not surprising. They're not very surprising if there's an ultimate story of triumph. uh,
And if it's okay, I'd like to ask another question real quick, and then I'll shut up and listen more. But my other question, and maybe this is more of a comment, but
mhm.
my I've had some exposure and some dialogue with atheists,
Mhm.
and what I've found is that when atheists write books defending atheism and criticizing religion, their books are often in the form of a narrative. If you read a book by Richard Dawkins, you're going to get a narrative about the development of life and how exciting evolution is in the natural world, and how animals use the various faculties that they've evolved into in order to survive, in order to flourish, and those kinds of things. And it's very story like. When I read
Mhm.
Richard Dawkins, it's
Mhm.
story like, but the problem is that Richard Dawkins' stories, they don't they are actually out of place in a naturalistic framework, because
Mhm.
in a naturalistic framework, no, we're all machines, and all of biological life is simply mindless machines, and still
Right.
stories don't matter to machines. And
So
so,
yeah.
in a way, that what they're really doing is they're borrowing a narrative approach from a theistic worldview, because it doesn't fit into the naturalistic worldview.
Well, and that's I'm honestly not very familiar with Dawkins' work, but one way of looking at this, like arguments against, like, let's say theism. I'll just use theism. An atheist could point out aspects or observations in the world that don't fit within the narrative, that actually detract or have no function or purpose or role within the narrative, and so that would be surprising if there's a grand unifying narrative of reality by a benevolent God. Some observation such as that, well, that's surprising. That's an anomaly that could even falsify the hypothesis. So we could kind of treat it like that, sort of like a scientific testing method of sorts. So yeah, and likewise, that would be a good way of like critiquing Dawkins' work, would be to, well, you have this narrative, but this thing you're saying here doesn't fit within that narrative. It doesn't make sense. Um,
Awesome. All right, cool. So I wanted to focus in on, so when you mention, look, this is kind of an abductive or a worldview comparison type
sure.
argument. So I hear ding ding, inference to the best explanation or the best worldview.
Yeah.
Um, Now, so I just wanted to ask you, how do you have kind of a systematic method or a set of criteria? Like, how do you decide which worldview is better than another? On what is your basis for?
Yeah, right. So that opens up a whole big topic within the philosophy of science itself, and that's the theoretical virtues used in theory choice. So we would look at things like ontological simplicity, explanatory depth, unification. One of the biggest ways to test a hypothesis is if a theory will it not only explain the data in question, but take independent, unrelated pieces of data and unify them into a coherent single explanation. That's one of the most powerful theoretical virtues is unification of independent pieces of data. Is internal coherence? Is it parsimonious? Is it elegant? So we would use these theoretical virtues and to determine the best hypothesis, and that would even be we would use the similar method of and Bayesian or a likelihood comparison as well.
Awesome, awesome. All right. No, one thing that I wanted to ask you about, it was one thing that I think you just hinted at in your opening, but you mentioned the dreaded prior probability issue. So I'm kind of
Mm-hmm.
wondering when we're doing if we're making this worldview comparison type argument, um,
Mm-hmm.
and again, it's for the existence of just keeping a general, relational, purposeful mind.
Yeah.
What would be the background knowledge or evidence that would be pertinent to the different narratives on that question? Do you think?
Well, one way is, it would vary depending on what your theological preference is, because I'm sort of in the mystical apophatic tradition. But like, let's say somebody like Josh Rasmussen, he would say that it has a high probability because he would say that it's pure ontological perfection with no arbitrary limits or imperfections. That it's a foundation to existence that's just purely actual in all of its fundamental properties. And so he would say that that has a high intrinsic probability, which is going to give it a high prior probability. And that's really where ontological simplicity is going to come in. But arguably, certain narratives, they may lack. So there may have to be some trade-offs. Like, a better explanation may not have as high of a prior, because it adds ontological commitments and so forth. So that's a whole other discussion in itself. But I really like Rasmussen's idea of just absolute perfection with no arbitrary limits. It's simple.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. I was going to ask you about the simplicity
Well,
opportunity thing. So
yeah, now there is some more to kind of touch on that because this opens up a can of worms too. Like you'll see atheologians like Oppie and others, and even on theists like Swinburne, they make a huge presentation of ontological simplicity and the least amount of ontological commitments. And there are some considerations with that. In fact, going with what I was just talking about, like when we're comparing the simplicity of a hypothesis, what's important is that we look at the simplicity of the seed hypothesis itself. So there are certain entailments and consequences of a theory being true, right? But you don't count those entailments and consequences against the simplicity of the seed hypothesis. So if we're looking at two things like naturalism, let's say a quantum field of sorts, or pure ontological perfection, or a foundational mind that's a perfect foundational mind, or what have you, you would look at the simplicity of that seed hypothesis. Then what it would entail, like these various what it would entail by being the foundation of reality. Like it would be the foundation of value, the foundation of morals, and these different things. You wouldn't count against the simplicity of that initial hypothesis. Does that make sense, or do I need to break it down more? That's going to be really important
yeah.
because
No,
a lot of times, you'll see, Oppie's bad about this. He'll say that, like, instead of just looking at the seed hypothesis, he will say that every ontological commitment a Christian has, like in virtue of God existing. Like, here's a good example of like the existence of angels and demons and things like that. He will count against the simplicity of theism, and that's not how it works in the philosophy of science. In the philosophy of science, you look at the initial seed hypothesis. So, like, let's say a quantum field or absolute perfection. Then the entailments and consequences of that theory being true, again, don't count against its initial simplicity.
Yeah, and
or its prior probability. Yeah.
Yep.
Well, and I have a quick question about that, Dale, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
So my question is, I think Swinburne himself even discovered that you have to raise the ontological complexity to a certain degree in order to differentiate God from other reference in the universe that might compete for his existence or might compete for his nature. And so that minimum floor of ontological complexity can't be at zero. It has to be up a few levels from zero, but you want to make sure that you only raise the floor to a minimal degree, no higher than you absolutely have to.
Right.
And so my question would be, what things would you add in order to raise that floor of complexity, just to make sure that you establish the primary nature of God and you account for his attributes? If you don't account for certain attributes like omniscience, omnipotence, and so on, then you haven't raised the floor high enough. And
right, yeah, that's a good question. Yeah. So again, it really depends. If I'm putting on my Orthodox Christian hat, then I would add quite a bit. But let's say if I'm having a discussion with an atheist who will not take any theological assumptions on, like will not accept them, what I would probably do is use Josh Rasmussen's approach. And so what he'll say is that he wouldn't even make a natural supernatural distinction. Instead, he'll look at existence as a whole and what the foundation of existence as a whole is. And he will say it's a supreme foundation, or a foundational mind, what he calls a mind first ontology. So what I would suggest is that at the root bedrock layer of reality, it's fundamentally mental. There's a mind first ontology. Then I would say the simplest account of this mind's nature is that it's perfect, and which means it's complete in all of its basic attributes, or you could even say supreme, a supreme mind. And so part of being supreme would entail things like maximum cognitive power, perfect goodness. It would, because we observe value in the world, so it would necessarily be the foundation of all value. The foundation of reality is the foundation of value. And so the way Rasmussen articulates that, he gets a lot of these, theistic, just from like a mind first ontology, then, deducing what the simplest properties of the foundation would be. And one of the simplest is that it's pure perfection, or let's just say purely actual. It has no arbitrary limits. It's the foundation of all limits itself. Whereas in natural hypothesis, there are these arbitrary limits, like, why this number of galaxies, why this amount of stars. And so the explanation, you have to explain why it has such an arbitrary limit or cutoff. So that adds complexity to the theory. So one of the most simplest accounts that gets you the theistic attributes is that there's a foundational mind that's purely actual. So, you could posit like, a foundational mind that, has goodness, all powerful goodness. You could either just say perfection, or, a foundational mind that's perfect, or you might add 2 or 3 attributes like goodness, all powerful, etc. But so either way, it's going to be simple.
It sounds like what you're doing is you're limiting the ontological complexity to the definitional level, and that way you can avoid all sorts of thorns from the rose that way. And because, and I think that's a safe thing to do, but I also think it's a wise thing to do, because if you say that there's such a thing as a as an all perfect mind, an all perfect, a morally perfect being, then what you're doing is you're saying that if God exists, then he must have certain attributes, and those become part of the actual definition of God, instead of an elaborate set of ontological attributes or ontological layers that you're going to pile on top, and those layers suddenly become commitments, and
Right.
and the more commitments you add, the more problematic it becomes. So that's what it sounds like you're doing, and I think it's a wise approach.
Right.
But
Well,
I just want to make sure I'm not misunderstanding it. So.
no, that's fairly accurate. Say, I got the idea from Josh Rasmussen, and I love his approach. He will look at it. Sometimes he won't even, the definition isn't even as complex as theism. He'll just say there's a mind first ontology. That the foundational bedrock layer of reality is fundamentally mental, and that the simplest account of that mental foundation is that it's supreme, perfect. It has no arbitrary limits of any kind. It's purely actual. Uh, and then he will kind of deduce, what that would entail. Like I was mentioning earlier, well, certain entailments would follow from that. And he argues that, it's the traditional theistic, godlike view. But yeah, so he keeps it really simple. He'll just say, a mind first ontology. Like, if there's a mind at the bedrock layer of reality, well, then the observation of consciousness is less surprising than a mindless universe. If there's a, perfect fundamental mind at the bedrock layer of reality, it's unsurprising to find agents with, moral awareness, moral agents in the world, and so forth. So it works really well, like looking at various theistic arguments as well.
Yeah, in terms of the arbitrary limits, I think a helpful example is analogy is from Richard Swinburne, where he uses the analogy of the gas tank, right? So if you find that your car has gas in it, it's far more simpler to assume that it's a full tank than expect it to be at some arbitrary limit.
Okay, yeah, that's a good, yeah, yeah, or like what if you're describing like a car, well, it's supreme. It has all the features that cars come with are just perfect. It's a perfect car. It's simple. Then, well, the gas tank's low. This headlights out, and these different arbitrary limits. So yeah, I like that.
Just to clarify, I meant a car at a gas station with the pump. Like it's going to be the simpler explanation is they filled it to the top. They didn't just fill it halfway or something like that. So, okay.
Yeah, that's helpful. Yeah.
No.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. It kind of gives these practical examples of why, just saying it's supreme would be more simple. So, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay. So Travis, so I hear you in terms of the simplicity argument for this mind. I forget how Rasmussen put it. This mind foundation,
mind first ontology. That at the bedrock layer, like the foundation of existence, is mental.
Gotcha. Okay, so what the thing I wanted to ask you with the criterion of simplicity here, that obviously this is used. There are different criteria of simplicity, right? There are quantitative versions.
Yes, there is.
There are also qualitative versions. So
right.
I just wanted to get from you, what are the different types of these criterions, and which one are you applying with this argument?
Well, with this one, it's ontological simplicity, and quantitative is actually arguably the more important aspect of simplicity. That sort of takes priority over the ontological simplicity, as a matter of fact. So that's really important as well. But with this, I'm wanting to keep the ontological simplicity there. But to be honest, Dale, the more important aspect is the explanatory depth and the principle of unification. And even its internal coherence, but this is primarily going to rest on explanatory depth and unification over the various types of simplicity. In fact, I think ontological simplicity is a little bit overrated within the philosophy of religion. It's important, but man, it gets pushed a lot in philosophy of religion.
Okay, all right, cool. So that's what I was going to ask you about, those next kind of things. So Explanatory depth. Is that the same as explanatory power? What
Yes,
is?
yes, it has a wide explanatory power or a robust explanatory power. Uh,
Gotcha. Okay.
yeah,
So yeah, I think you've been pretty clear in explaining how the worldview comparison argument handles that, right? It's with respect how well does each worldview explain the given facts from the existence of the cosmos,
right.
the fine tuning, whatever
Yeah,
facts.
and even suffering and apparent divine hiddenness and so on. And again, to also kind of stress the idea that unification is one of the most important theoretical virtues. Like think about it. If you have two explanations and one can not only explain the data of what you're testing, but it would also unify these different unrelated fields into a singular explanation, that gives it a very high probability of being the more parsimonious explanation for everything. And so unification is a huge theoretical virtue this is resting on as well. Basically, the explanatory power or depth and unification.
Yeah, so the unification. So okay, so I wanted to ask about that. I see that as kind of a combination of explanatory scope and also the criterion of illumination, like going outside of the relevant facts. It can also
Right. Yeah. So there's kind of this idea of like, are you talking about like internal coherence, where a theory that is doesn't have to tack on additional theoretical content to solve isolated problems, or were you speaking of something else?
that would kind of be like the criterion of illumination is kind of where it's like look this theory can unify with other data that's not necessarily relevant to the other thing. It can also
Oh, I
explain
see. I see.
additional facts. Where explanatory scope
Yeah.
is, it explains all the relevant facts or a greater
Exactly.
number of
Yes.
facts. So where I wanted to ask you the question on the explanatory scope thing is, I wanted to kind of push back about the mind foundation worldview as the best explanation, given things like evil or apparent hiddenness.
Okay.
Some of the atheology arguments and stuff like
Okay.
that. Um, so obviously, what's if you have an atheist pushing back, they would say obviously, well, clearly atheism or naturalism
Right.
fit better, has
Indifference.
greater explanatory power, and it explains those facts much better than at
Yeah.
least mind, relational, purposeful mind worldview.
Well, see, that's the idea. Well, I would argue it doesn't actually, but where this is going to be competing with those is in the idea of a narrative of redemption and eventual triumph. And what I'm saying, Dale, is that, well, hey, look, let's say you're an atheist, you're positing indifference at the foundation of reality. That reality is just fundamentally indifferent, and that's why observe all the hiddenness and so forth that we observe. And I'm saying, well, no, actually, it makes more sense and is actually less surprising if there's a divine narrative of eventual triumph and redemption of creatures, like including animals and humans, that all creatures go through this, like, are driven towards redemption and eventual triumph. I'm saying that would make it less surprising than just indifference.
So that's where I would come back with kind of our arbitrary limits objection, because given this even let's take the Christian theistic worldview
Mhm.
I would expect there to be, God would just create a perfect universe and stuff like that. Like, why wouldn't
Oh, I see.
be at a maximal level? Why go through this need for redemption and all this stuff?
Right. So I think that's a really important point. And it was kind of sort of, it was alluded to in my opening presentation, but that'll let us shine the light of reason on it right now. And so this is going to be depending on what kind of axiological framework we're going with. And so you're kind of putting this deontological objection. Well, there are some states of affairs that, a perfect God just shouldn't allow, and so forth. And there's also what's known as a necessity condition. And that's this idea where a moral agent, will only permit, bad states of affairs to prevent something worse from happening, or if it would halt some forthcoming good, then it's okay to permit an evil in that. That's what's known as a necessity condition. It's kind of like what you and I as human moral agents are under. And this, on the other hand, is relying on the defeat, an axiological notion of defeat. And that's where we look at the wholes. Instead of hyper focusing on the parts, we look at the whole, what obtains on the whole, instead of, it's kind of like I gave the idea of a mosaic where the seemingly broken pieces fit together into a beautiful whole. And so on this axiology, God will permit what can ultimately be defeated within the overall lifetime of the creature. And so that's just going to be a difference in axiology right there.
Awesome.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think you've answered all my questions. I had one last one, but you already answered that. I was going to say, in the end, how do these criteria relate to each other? So let's say atheism is simpler, but theism has greater explanatory power or something like that. Like, how do we make an overall assessment? But
one thing I'd like to come back to was the pushback aspect. And, as far as our what kind of axiological framework, I think it's important that we mentioned from the start that this, and I believe I said it, that this is based on a defeat-based axiology, because there are certain deontological arguments from evil you could present, like, well, a perfectly good God should not permit this no matter what, even if it can be defeated. And this is going off more of a defeat principle. And I would kind of stack on top of that if you look at Christian history throughout the church age, like the writings of the church fathers and what have you, they fundamentally had this notion of defeat, as opposed to like modern notions of God being like a human moral agent and so forth. I would add that he's moral, but he's not more in the same, he's in a position as God to operate under a defeat principle, whereas we're more tied into a necessity condition.
Gotcha. All right, cool. I'll bring in Phil at this point. Do you have any questions based on what we've been kind of going over here?
Well, I think you've alluded to this already a little bit, Travis, but I wanted to explore a little bit further, and that is the role that personality plays in the ontology of God. Because if I remember right, Swinburne defined a person as a being with powers, beliefs, and purpose. I think those are the three attributes of a person that defined a person. And in the case of God, it would be powers and knowledge and purpose, because God doesn't have mere beliefs. Any belief that God has is obviously factually true and propositionally true. But if you're going to form a narrative about God and give it lots of explanatory power, I would think that one of the most powerful aspects of that would be how it explains the existence of personality in the universe that we can see around us, especially in human beings.
So there are different ways, like a narrative approach isn't really tied into any one specific form, like notion of God. But I'll give mine. So this is going off more of like the Greek patristic tradition, and they viewed ontology as being relational, or you could even call it a communal, sort of Eucharistic ontology. And that's this idea where the Trinity is defined not so much as what it is, but as how it relates to one another, like the love of the Father and then the Holy Spirit. That foundational love of the Trinity, its relational nature. And that, through the idea of theosis, where God, being perfectly good is inclined, he freely chooses to spread his goodness and create other beings who can eventually participate in that same love, like join the Trinity and so forth. And so I think a Eastern sort of relational ontology would fit in really well with that. But there are, there's obviously other views, you get attached to a narrative. It doesn't have to be any one specific.
Well, and part of the reason I ask is that I've been heavily influenced by Francis Schaeffer. I've told Dale that the other night, and Schaeffer, a great deal. In fact, an almost central component of Schaeffer's systematic was that that we see personality in the universe, and the only explanation for the existence of personality is to propose that there's a creator who is also personal, and that we have those
Sure.
we have that attribute in common. And if there is no creator who is personal, then personality, according based on Schaeffer's terminology and based on Schaeffer's phraseology, it said personality has appeared out of a hat.
Hmm.
And I think that is one of the most powerful explanatory
Absolutely.
elements of theism, and that I would think that that would lend itself beautifully into a narrative approach,
Hmm.
because persons are going to facilitate stories in history, and are going to do things that people can write stories about,
Right.
and
That's
that
why I
people.
said stories are the kind of things that minds do.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
And 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 relationship is one of the things that persons do.
Yes.
It's
Yes.
hard to it's really hard to imagine an impersonal being having a relationship with another being.
Sure.
So relations point to personality, personality points to narrative, and points to actually making decisions and causing
Hmm.
certain things to occur in the universe, and then people can write stories about what occurs in the universe. And so all those things are so, I think they weave a tapestry that is so
Oh, yeah.
powerful in my mind. And so that's where I'm seeing a lot of intersection between a logical approach to apologetics and a narrative approach to apologetics,
Yeah.
because a narrative is never going to stray away from reason as much as some storytellers would like it to.
Hmm.
And if that's the case, then I think blending those two can be, again, power. I just like to use the word powerful, because
Oh, yeah.
that's just how I see it. So
Yeah, yeah, I think that's very well said. I really appreciate you highlighting that. And I think one further thing I would add in terms of the explanatory power that's really good is you see this in the church fathers, and you even see it in Swinburne. Richard Swinburne writes about this in The Existence of God. That there's what's known as the Dionysian principle, and that's that goodness is of its very nature diffusive. It spreads, and so if we posit God as the good or perfect goodness or what have you, then it would be unsurprising that he would spread his goodness. And so, we can, theism would predict that we come to, see valuable states of affairs obtaining. And one of the best ways is through this defeat axiology I was talking about, where we see, a good whole obtained, that creation is integrated into an overall good whole. Um, and so I think that lends itself to that as well.
yeah, it's great.
Awesome. So, all right. So, I guess I have one last question, unless Phil has anything else as well. But I wanted to kind of ask, going beyond that, with the Christian, making the argument for the Christian worldview. Um, so
Okay.
we have the set of facts, from the existence of the universe, even including suffering and apparent hiddenness and all this stuff. Um, what about other theistic religions? They also, I mean, other religions do address the issue of suffering,
Hmm. Yes. Yes.
like a theistic Buddhism, for example. Again, we don't may not like their answers to it, but they do at least give an
Oh,
answer.
sure.
So
Yeah.
how would we compare various theistic religions that report to account for all of the same facts? Like, how would we
Yeah.
the Christian one's better than?
I think that's a very thoughtful question. I really appreciate you kind of highlighting that. I think that's incredibly valuable to take into consideration. And one thought I have is that, you know, when, like, let's say the problem of evil, well, it seems to me that we would want a view, a narrative whereby, God can ultimately integrate and defeat the evil. that this I really like a Christological narrative to where God relates intersolidarity with our suffering, that He shares our plight into the material world out of love, and has this way of redeeming our suffering and restoring meaning, that He restores meaning making. So there are these different aspects of how the narrative has unfolded that I think really make a Christological narrative the most robust. But at the same time, I do want to say that this narrative approach, it could be openly like if Hindu or Buddhist can, put together this really robust narrative that would account for reality in a robust way, then yeah, that would be fair. And so it really comes down to the nature of the story and how well it can explain reality. And I think I would make a case that a Christological narrative really has the most robust explanatory power in unification.
Awesome. All right, cool. So, yeah, Phil, we're 3 minutes away from the 1 hour mark. I promised Travis we would end at the 1 hour mark. So Phil, I'll give you. Do you have any last questions for Travis, or if not?
Well, not a very in depth one, because I'm very interested in your target audience for this narrative approach. Do you see it as something that would be valuable for the non-believer or for the skeptic, or more valuable for a person of faith who is in a crisis of faith, in order to reinforce their faith and prevent them from leaving? And part of the reason I ask that is because I've written a book called Machines Don't Laugh, and it's basically designed for believers who are in danger of deconverting because of the influence of atheism out there.
Yeah, and I think that's really important. As of right now, I would say the target audience is pretty much the philosophy of religion. So not even strictly apologetics or counter apologetics, but more philosophical at this point. Ultimately, I would hope for it to be apologetic in nature and philosophical. But for right now, I'm wanting to do it as sort of a way to compare our theories, like because within the philosophy of religion, it's really come down heavily to you theory comparison. Like if you read the dialogue book, "Is God the Best Explanation of Things?" with Felipe Leon and Josh Rasmussen, you can tell they're really comparing two theories, and it's remarkable how much they actually have in common, and it's which theory would better explain reality. So I think there's a really robust case for it to be made within philosophy of religion more broadly. But I think it also has a lot of apologetic value because it's a robust way of making sense of the world. Like it's you can identify as a Christian and you have this real sense of you can make sense of the world. Like these observations that we see make sense. It fits in to the narrative, and these certain other things that we find difficult. Well, they're not altogether unsurprising. They're not altogether surprising if we had this sort of unifying narrative going on. And so, yeah.
Awesome. All right, cool. Well, as promised, we'll wrap up. I'll just give each of the guests a chance to make any plugs they want before we head out. So, Travis, go ahead if you have any websites or books or papers, anything you want to tell the audience.
Well, I did have a paper I shared with you over email. I wrote for academia.edu, and that's sort of the Eastern Orthodox, how they respond to the problem of evil. I don't necessarily endorse every single aspect of it, but it's sort of highlighting how they look at the problem of evil. So I put a bit of work into that, which I think is good, if I do say so myself.
Awesome. But I'll be posting the link in the blog for the audience, so you can check that out.
Yeah, but pretty much, I just have this love for philosophy of religion and theology. I'm a really big theology nerd. So one place to find me is Travis Worth on Facebook. And it's okay to message me on there because I mainly use my Facebook account just for like philosophical discussions and theology and stuff. I don't really use it for socially too much. So it's mainly just for like, just philosophical discussions and so forth. So that's one place you can find me. And don't be, you don't have to worry about, oh, should I message him or what? It's fine. That's what I use my Facebook account for.
Awesome. All right, and Phil, over to you. Make any plugs you want, any books or sites or videos.
Well, I would just plug my Machines Don't Laugh book. I've got the cover on there,
It's up.
and I would be interested in hearing, Travis, what you think of it. It's actually a very short read. It's only like 115 pages.
Okay.
And it's designed for Christians because so many Christians are deconverting these days and they're dropping like flies out there. And this book is to try to help Christians avoid deconversion, and because they're
awesome.
becoming convinced that God does not exist in record numbers. And this book is kind of a counteracting that trend and hopefully,
okay.
yeah.
That's good. One thing I think that's important for those that are deconverting is not only these philosophical arguments for God's existence, but also having good theology. Because I've seen a lot of people deconvert. I won't mention any names, but it's been only because of bad theology. It's like, I don't even believe that about God. And so, yeah.
Yeah. It's a good point.
Awesome. Well, yeah, I just want to say thank you guys both for coming on and doing this. Travis, it was a great argument. Thank you to Phil for joining in as my fellow interrogator and interviewing Travis there. So, yeah. So just so the audience knows, my next show. So I don't think I'm going to be on tomorrow. I haven't heard back from Nadir Ahmed about debating the Quran and science. So the next show will be on Saturday with Jamie Castro on, he wants to talk about politics and Christianity. So look out for that on Saturday morning. But otherwise, have a great day.